Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to our podcast this week. I'm Clay Jenkinson. This week, Lindsay Chervinsky and Dr. Casey Burgat. He's George Washington University, an assistant professor of political management, and they are contributors to, and he's the editor of a new book, We Hold These Truths is in quotes, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back. There are the following essays in it: The Founders and Their Infinite Wisdom, I Vote the Issues, Not the Party, The President Should Just, Members of Congress Don't Do Anything, The Supreme Court Has Become Too Political, Politicians Are Bought and Paid For, Lobbyists Are Evil, Term limits will fix our broken Congress, Bipartisanship is Dead, I Wish Parties Would Work Together, The Filibuster Forces Compromise, The Media Wants to Polarize Us, Keep Your Politics Out of My Sports. Different contributors, some of them members of Congress, others scholars and professors and writers. Anyway, fascinating conversation. We couldn't go into great detail on all of this, but it really was insightful, and I freely admit that I have succumbed to a number of these myths, and I will try to be more rigorous in my thinking about it. It's always great to see Lindsay. She's a fan favorite. She's my favorite, and we've really become friends. We're going to be on stage together in Vail, Colorado at the end of March. Go to Vail Symposium, and you'll get all the details. I've got a secret gift for her that I brought back from France, which I will present to her on stage. If you want to meet Lindsay, come. I'm sure they'll be selling her book, The Bookworm, which is a wonderful independent bookstore in the Vail Valley, has been selling books at our events for the last couple of years, and they will feature it. She'll probably do a special signing, so do plan to come to that. We're also doing an event on, I think, May 8th in Virginia, so that's all coming up too. That's about the time that I launch year 2 of my Airstream tours. I'm just in the deep planning stages of that now, and it's going to be really, really extraordinary. I'm just back, by the way, from 8 days in Europe. I had maybe the best birthday of my life. It's not one that I had looked forward to, but nevertheless. And it was all made possible by my daughter. She planned amazing events, proving that the greatest gifts are gifts of thoughtfulness, really generosity of spirit, and amazing. So I got to see some rare books about and by Dr. Samuel Johnson, one of my heroes. He was at Pembroke College, Oxford. My daughter is now a postdoc research fellow at Pembroke College. So we went there and genuflected at Dr. Johnson's rooms. He's the subject of the greatest biography in the English language by James Boswell, The Life of Dr. Samuel Johnson. We took the Channel under the English Channel. I've written about that at ltamerica.org. We went to Notre Dame, which has been repaired at enormous cost by the French government. We went to Sainte-Chapelle, which is essentially a stained glass cathedral built to house the crown of thorns, one of the most important of all Christian relics. We went to the Louvre. I admit that I have never seen the Mona Lisa, and was able to see it on a Wednesday night, and there were only about, 50 people edging their way forward to get as close to that incredible piece of art as they could. We then went to Geneva and to Vevey and Lausanne to meet Catherine's friend Simon's family. We went to see Rousseau's house in Geneva. We saw a marvelous monument to the Reformation. I went to an abbey library across the country, saw Lake Geneva on an absolutely perfect day. It was really a truly amazing journey, and I'm still filled with deep gratitude and just a sense of how extraordinary a child I happen to have in my world, and how important that is to me. So all of that. Anyway, this program is about the future of government and myths. that we tend to live by, even though those myths are not really true. So again, the title, We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back, edited by Dr. Casey Burgat, B-U-R-G-A-T, of George Washington University. It's 2025. Things are really heating up in my world. I'm off to Santa Fe tomorrow to plan this year's Lewis and Clark journey, and I could not be more pleased to be the host and originator of this program. If you can help us, please do. This is an expensive set of initiatives that we're engaged in, and our new friends group is now up and running. Please join at the highest level that you would like. There will be lots of added content, and there are people to hold our feet to the fire for that added content. We'll be having periodic Zoom meetings, and Lindsay will be part of some of those. So it's going to be a really extraordinary new era in our work. So let's go to the show, shall we? Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I have two guests today. Of course, the famous, the infamous Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of several books about the Founding Fathers, most recently on John Adams. And a second guest today, Dr. Casey Burgat, assistant professor at George Washington University, the editor of a new book that I'm excited to hear more about. We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back. We hold these truths in air quotes, how to spot the myths that are holding America back. Everyone knows Lindsay. Welcome, Casey. May I call you Casey?
Of course, please.
All right, so how do you know Lindsay, and how have you roped her into this book?
Yeah, she was just out begging on a street. No, we met because we were introduced by, as DC is, by a fellow friend. And I lead a master's program at George Washington University. I wanted to get the presidency class back on the schedule. It had been off the schedule for too long, and there was only one person to teach it. So begged and begged and begged Lindsay to come, and she ultimately agreed. And since then, we've had some projects and some fun ever since.
It sounds good. Now, this book, We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back. I didn't know that anything was holding America back, Casey.
I don't either. Yeah, we just made them up. We just, everything's fine. There's nothing bad going on. Politics is as it should be. So yeah, you're right. We just got bored and put something to paper.
You know, you got to make up some stuff here.
Clickbait.
The Founding Fathers said they were building a machine that would go of itself. I thought it was in prime oiled condition. So eager to know. Let me go over these titles. Number one, The Founders and Their Infinite Wisdom, ... That's an article by Lindsay Chervinsky. I Vote the Issues, Not the Party. The President Should Just... blah, blah, blah. Members of Congress Don't Do Anything. The Supreme Court Has Become Too Political. Politicians Are Bought and Paid For. Lobbyists Are Evil. Term Limits Will Fix Our Broken Congress. That's your contribution, Casey. Bipartisanship Is Dead. I Wish the Parties Would Work Together. The Filibuster Forces Compromise. The Media Wants to Polarize Us. And Keep Your Politics Out of My Sports. So a wide-ranging view. So let's start with you, Casey. Everyone knows Lindsay. Term limits will fix our broken Congress. No?
No, they won't. I mean, it's often painted as this cure-all silver bullet thing that will solve all of the ills of our Congress, and there are many. But the reality is that if they were to be adopted at the federal level, they would make everything that they're intending to make better infinitely and exponentially worse. It is it's one of the best polling ideas we have out there to fix a broken Congress, but it is one that will cause infinitely more damage.
No, Mr. Jefferson said rapid rotation. We need amateurs to move in and out of these like jury duty. You leave your farm behind, you go reluctantly to Washington, you serve with great humility and diffidence, you retire as soon as people will let you retire, and that's the nature of a republic. You saying that he was wrong?
I guess so. I mean, yeah, yes. This is
Welcome to the club.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, it sounds great. The ideal is great, and it is something to be pursued. But the reality is a much, much different thing, especially in 2025, where we should treat lawmaking as the career that it should be. It is hard and imperfect and messy, and to pretend otherwise just leads us to get amateurs. If you think amateurs are in Congress right now, make it so that they can't have a job longer than 8 or 12 years. where there's a steep learning curve and no school for what it is to be a federal lawmaker. Term limits would make a very unprofessional legislature and a much, much more unprofessional.
So these careerists who come for 2 years into the House and say, maybe I'll run for maybe one more term, and they wind up with 6, and then they go to the Senate where they serve in 3 terms of 6 years each. These lifers, you're saying, I think, gain understanding of procedures. They know the nature of how Congress works. They know the size and the limitations of American bureaucracy. They maybe become an expert on something like roads or education or cyber terror. Is that the argument, that it takes time to get good at this, and once you're good at it, we don't want to fire you?
Well, one argument for sure, and notice how you said careerist, where the reality is the modal member of Congress doesn't stay for life. I say long-standing members of Congress, you're probably thinking Grassley or Pelosi or McConnell, Feinstein even, who died in office, but the average member of Congress does only serve about 8 years on the House side, about 12 years on the Senate side. So that's a small segment of the population that we're talking about. Even more than that, I mean, there is a steep learning curve with Congress, but the reality is that no one is qualified to be a member of Congress to the degree that we expect them to be. They vote on a Tuesday on everything from immigration to ethanol subsidies to Medicare benefits. Like, who is prepared for that? And if you create an instance where they're not going to be there for long, despite their voters wanting them to be, then you're just going to empower people who are unelected, whether it's bureaucrats or long-serving staffers or the president himself, or more often than not, the special interest groups who do have that expertise. So the more you churn out these people who learn on the job, the more you're just going to make them dependent on the exact same swamp creatures that we're trying to drain out of the system anyway.
All right, so you're saying that the average senator serves a couple of terms and the average representative serves a few terms, and then they meld back into private life or become lobbyists, whichever is the more advantageous to them, and that if we just rotated people in and out, average American citizens, it would be not only no better, but a colossal failure.
Yeah, it'd be worse. I mean, the reality is that there's only a certain type of person that will run for this office, right? Like, to want to be in and around politics is one subset of people, especially in 2025, where the minute you announce your candidacy, half the country hates you. Like, there has just always been people who have been predispositioned to this, just like people become teachers or people become lawyers, to think that there can just be a random draw of an average citizenry and we ultimately get a better, more functioning Congress. It's just a pipe dream that just will never, ever be. And we have plenty of evidence from state experiments with this, with term limits and foreign countries trying term limits. And it just makes unelected folks even more powerful than we think that they are right now.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Do you also apply that to the judiciary branch, or is that only a myth in regards to the legislature?
I don't even step on the judiciary. I think that there is a reasonable case to make for their tenure, so long as good behavior is followed. Plus, there are avenues for Congress or the legislative branch to impeach or get rid of poorly behaving judicial actors.
You know, we have the example of Mitch McConnell, who has been blanking out, standing in front of a podium. Senator Grassley, Senator Feinstein, deeply impaired, dies in office. Shouldn't we have a limit somewhere? How about 6 terms? How about, you can serve until you're 70? I get it that we don't want to be ageist, but isn't it embarrassing when the
Republican congressman who was actually in a dementia facility and was still serving in Congress?
And again, how would we know? But yes, isn't that embarrassing to the Republic, Casey?
Yeah, but two things can be true at the same time. It is embarrassing and it's still bad policy, right? Notice the through line with everyone you just mentioned wasn't their effectiveness in Congress, it was their age. So if you want to solve an age problem or a mental capacity problem, then let's solve the problem that we're trying to do. Let's institute age limits then. That is different than term limits, which would fundamentally group in everyone that is effective and popular and young, so long as they serve that same amount of time as those old people we're trying to get rid of. It's kicking them out at the same rate. And so if we're worried about age limits or worried about mental capacity, let's create a reform to solve that problem and not group everyone in or paint with the same exact brush.
Easy question for you first, Lindsay. Do you agree with that argument?
Yes, next question.
Yeah, I do. I see the value. I mean, I think part of the problem is like there are congressmen who take the job seriously and do develop areas of expertise and dig in, especially on certain committees. And then there are those that are hooligans and are not going to take the job seriously, and no amount of restriction on the time that they're in Congress is going to make them less of a hooligan. I think Casey's point about like trying to solve the problem you're actually trying to solve is an important one. And we're not necessarily saying that we don't want people to be around for a long time. We're saying we want them to suck less. From what I understand, based on studies both at the state level and looking at other nations, you end up transferring a lot of power to lobbyists. And I don't think that is an outcome that most people would think is preferable.
All right, so Lindsay, you got roped into writing an essay on this, the founders and their infinite wisdom. How did you get involved in this project?
Casey has done too many favors for me to say no when he asked me to write something is probably the starting point. I have a select group of friends who I try not to say no to because they usually don't say no to me, and Casey's in that group. Plus, it didn't really require any research because this is something you and I have talked a lot about the founders not being godlike figures. They were very much fallible. They were very much flawed. So since this was a bit of a hobby horse for me anyway, it was a pretty easy yes to give.
All right, so the founders in their infinite wisdom, ... I take it you don't want to shatter that myth entirely.
No, I mean, I think where I was taking on the myth was this idea that they had all the answers. And so we can refer to what they created and what they said as the holy grail and the roadmap for all things. And I come at that from a couple of different directions. One, the idea that they rarely agreed on anything, as you and I regularly discuss. Secondarily, they very much intended the Constitution and their creation to be flexible and ongoing. We've talked a lot about the fuzzy bits of the presidency that Washington and Adams had to fill out long after the Constitution was actually put on paper. And so if they intentionally were creating a flexible system with gaps and vagueness to allow future officials to operate effectively.
We need to take a break, but before we go, one last quick question for you, Lindsay. The founders in their infinite wisdom, who is the least flawed of the founders?
That is a very weighty and problematic question.
I thought you'd just say George Washington. Next question.
Well, I mean, that's probably what I should say for my job.
If you want job security, you certainly would.
I certainly think he was the most indispensable founder. But, I think the slavery piece is hard to overcome. And that was not a flaw that at least John Adams had. Now, John Adams had his own flaws that Washington mastered. Adams sometimes had trouble keeping his tongue and having a poker face. And these were important qualities in politics, and Washington certainly mastered them. So I'll go with indispensable as opposed to least flawed.
We're going to take a short break. I have the great joy of talking to two professors today, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, now the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and Dr. Casey Burgat, Assistant Professor of Political Management at George Washington University, co-authors, in part, of the book We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Listening to America. Great joy for me. Lindsay Chervinsky is here, as she frequently is. I'll be appearing on stage with her in none other than Vail, Colorado at the end of March, and in Virginia in May. Amazing, Lindsay. We're going to finally meet and duke it out. I have a special gift that I brought for you from Europe, and I can't wait.
That's exciting. Oh, is it going to be like a bust of Jefferson with a quote in French or something?
Jeez, you would be so lucky as to have a Udon bust of Thomas Jefferson, but that's fine. Really? No, I'm not giving it to you now. All right. So
no take backsies.
No take back, yes, exactly. All right. So let's go on. So Casey, this is your book. You are the one who decided to do this. We get that the country's broken and all of that. Talk about the process. So you decide that this is a good idea. How do you make a book?
I had a couple different cut points. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, mostly because a lot of these chapters are things that when people find out I am in politics, they constantly want to talk about it. But I just kept finding and becoming more and more frustrated, including with my students, that we talk about these things all wrong and we just keep having to do it over and over and over again. And so I wanted to finally put these things down in one document, one resource that I can finally just point to and say, let's get past these conversations so that we can have the meaningful and important debates about what to do about things like immigration and climate change and Social Security and Elon, though I didn't have Elon on my list except until a few months ago. So then the second cut point was, all right, should I do this on my own? Or should I go find people who are even smarter and more articulate than I am, who live these jobs in a lot of these instances, practitioners who can explain these myths from their own perspectives as a means of maybe being better able to convince people than some liberal DC professor could on his own. So I went and found the best and the brightest, Lindsay at the top of that list. And I was absolutely shocked at how few people said no, that they had frustrations about their particular topic too, about, constantly having these same conversations, trying as strong as they might to move on and get people in a reasonable way to think differently or deeper about some of these things that we have been fighting about for far too long. And we all jumped on this same board and then found a publisher who not only was supportive of the idea, but recognized the need of the moment. And this was back in early 2024, where we knew we were going to have an election. All we knew it was going to be close and it was going to be partisan. And so someone who was buying in for the long haul, knowing that the immediacy of now often takes precedence of publishing decisions, so that the more flammable you can be, the more controversial you can be, the more burn it down you can be, that often translates to book sales. And they recognize that this is purposefully not that. And I appreciated that with them and went and found some contributors to help me make that case.
How can we get this book? Who published it? And how can we, my listeners, get it? Because here's the thing. They'll do anything Lindsay asks.
That's true. And that's why that was also part of my calculation. But you can get it anywhere where you get your books. We are huge supporters of independent bookstores. So if you can do that, please do. But Amazon carries it too. Barnes & Noble. It's in every single Barnes & Noble across the country, which is awesome. And the publisher is called Authors Equity. And it's a new publishing outfit under the Simon & Schuster distribution network that is run by the former CEOs of Macmillan and Penguin Random House. They partnered up together to kind of change the model of publishing, which was also something that I found pretty intriguing about their process.
Let's stay with
Fun
Congress.
book fact that a lot of people don't know: if a local bookstore does not have a book that you want, but you have a favorite bookstore, ask them to order it for you, and they can do that. So that's something that not everybody is aware of, but is very important to support our local stores.
Thank you for that. So sticking with the Congress here, members of Congress don't do anything by Representative Derek Kilmer. Now, I know that's not true. They beg for money 24 hours a day. They get themselves on media whenever possible, shoving their way in. They engage in insider trading tips with each other. Come on, we know that they do a great deal. Who's going to pick this up? Lindsay, you start.
Well, the chapters that I actually, it was really fun to be at the workshop when we were sharing these chapters, because I learned a great deal from experts as well. And this is one of the chapters where it actually looks at the sort of legislation that flies under the radar. That's not the stuff that gets the big headlines, because it's not budget reconciliation and you don't have Politico writing about it every day for 3 weeks and talking about shutdowns. But that legislation does have to happen, that Congress does have to authorize our military expenditures, that all of these sort of things on a day-to-day basis do actually occur, in addition to approving appointments, whether or not you think that they should. And as part of that, building in on some of the other chapters, oftentimes a lot of these activities are much more bipartisan than you would think. So while I don't think this is a particularly serious example, for at least one thing to note was recently, I think that Congress passed a bipartisan bill designating the bald eagle as the national bird of the United States. Now, if maybe that you could make the argument that that's maybe not how they should have been spending their time, but they did at least pass that bill.
Casey, sometimes when I have nothing better to do, I'll turn C-SPAN on, or one of the 7 or 8
Bless you, child.
C-SPAN platforms, and you'll see a hearing, and it'll be about something like the interstate highway construction in inner cities in America. And what I'm always struck by is how little posturing there is when it's not one of the cutting cultural issues, how well prepared most members of Congress seem to be, and how they ask questions that really do help them make sense of how to solve problems in America. And I always think when I watch that, if this is a good picture of American politics, of the workings of Congress, then I'm all for it. But then you turn on Fox and MSNBC, and it's just brickbats and shouting, and people going to the mat over the SNAP program, or going to the mat over the wall on the Mexican border. So there seems to be like a crazy public surface Congress that just likes to fight and impede progress, and then there seems to be like a dull, productive Congress that works day in and day out. Is that fair?
It is fair. I mean, both of those exist, right, within Congress, and it's issue dependent and also member of Congress dependent. Because if I asked you the names of members of Congress that you're most likely to see on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, you could give me a list. But if I asked you for the names of members of Congress who are in your first world, the ones asking good faith questions, the ones that are not interested in the partisan mudslinging, you'd struggle much more to give me a list outside of maybe your member of Congress who you probably like. And so this is what we get. There are incentive structures for both. And right now, the incentive structure to be the flamethrower, to be the loudest in the room, to be the one that gets on the media outlets is stronger than the one to be the other one. Read another chapter in our book about why bipartisanship is so hard. That the incentive structure is not necessarily to get the law, but to build a brand, a personal one, to fundraise off of it, to maybe get your next job, or at least be in better graces of the media outlets or the donors, or even right now the President of the United States. Those are two very different ways of doing business, but both exist. So this chapter, members of Congress don't do anything. You hear the word recess all the time, and you probably think that they're out there playing laser tag, right? Or that, not maybe in the Senate because they would break their hips, but they would be outside not doing their job. And that's just fundamentally, I mean, legislating is but one of their duties. Oversight obviously is another, but the constituent services demands on members of Congress eat up so much of their time, where they are chunked out in literally 7-minute meeting increments. And that's when they're in DC. So when they do go back home, they often work harder than when they're in DC. And so it was helpful to have this chapter written by an actual member of Congress, probably one you've never heard of because he's one of those good faith legislators, literally put down his schedule on an average day. And you'll see how it's chunked up, not only to expose that they're not just kicking their feet up, or as you mentioned, Clay, going to the DCCC or RCCC, raising millions of dollars, though they do have to do that, but that they're actually meeting with stakeholders, they're meeting with constituents, they're meeting with policymakers in an attempt to get educated on issues for which they're going to have to attach their name next to, if not on a bill, then at least on a vote. And that's the more representative type of Congress that may not get the play on Fox News or MSNBC, but the one that if you do turn on C-SPAN, you can see that a lot of members of Congress whose names you've never heard of are actually trying to play out.
Of course, they all have staff, but it must be a grueling sort of work and not particularly glamorous, Casey.
Yeah, welcome to my dissertation, my friend. Like, this is my role before this, after working on the Hill, is trying to get people to understand that government is huge, but it's often huge in the wrong places. And it's huge in the places that aren't responsible for funding the government or overseeing the government. And this is why we see things like Doge and Elon come in and have a huge impact, because they're taking advantages of Congress's failure to do its constitutional duties that they have been pretending to do effectively for a long time now. Congress is of both parties. And so a staff life, you are often working namelessly, anonymously in support of your members' ideals and wishes. The hours are bad. Your pay is horrible in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Half of the country, just like members, hates you too, just by virtue of the D or R attached to your name. Plus, everyone distrusts and thinks that you should be eliminated anyway. You ask the average person how big actually, let's do this right now. Clay, how many staffers does a member of Congress have? A House member?
12.
On average, it's 18, okay? But split up district staff and DC staff. You get down to it, you start eliminating the driver, you start eliminating the scheduler, the administrative assistant. You're down to 3 staffers, 3, to do all of the policy making work of that member of Congress. 3. And they're often, on average, about 25 years old. They will leave within the next couple of years because the private sector will pay them better and treat them better. And then you just have this constant churning of legislative staffers who are literally the ones writing the bills. It's no wonder why we can't seem to get anything done or passed that will be effective outside of the big bills that are negotiated by leadership.
No, I won't ask you who actually wrote the articles that were written by the Congress people in this book, but that's another question. All right, Lindsay, let me go to you now on the Supreme Court. This is an issue that's of enormous importance now, and the public perception of the court has plummeted. You know, it used to be that the 9 men in black robes were sort of seen as a phalanx of relatively nonpartisan, relatively sage individuals. The court has really undergone some very significant decline in the public eye in the United States, and it is said everywhere I go, the Supreme Court has become too political. It's said more than that. It's said that the Supreme Court has become the third political branch of our Constitution. What say you?
This myth can be taken down in so many different ways, and it's taken down in a couple ways in this chapter. One, the Supreme Court was intent that I think we should draw a distinction between partisan and political, because those are important, different categories. The Supreme Court in the 19th century was both intensely partisan and intensely political. Justices were involved in campaigns. Justices ran for president. Justices were involved in partisan newspapers. How it was in the second half of the 20th century is how it has always been. So that's the way to take it down, number one. Number two, in some ways, it is actually not political enough, because it used to be very involved with Congress, in that Congress used to regularly regulate the Supreme Court in terms of pay, in terms of number of seats, in terms of security and support staff, and also in terms of jurisdiction. Congress controls what is the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. And like so many other things, Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility for oversight over one of the other branches. And if Congress doesn't work as a functioning branch of government, which despite previous conversation, it's largely broken, it cannot hold the Supreme Court in check in the way that it needs to be. And there actually needs to be more political involvement between the two different branches.
Okay, so more oversight. I'm with you there. And of course, we know from famous cases of the 19th century that these were not dispassionate Platonic judges sitting in serene rationality and with a deep sense of human dignity, just the opposite in many cases. But it does feel, since Gore v. Bush in 2000, that the Supreme Court seems more overtly partisan than it used to be. Is that a fair view?
Well, yes and no. So the reason it feels that way is because for the first time, a lot of the decisions that are coming out of the court are overlapping quite perfectly or closely with both the party preferences and the president that appointed them. So previously, we would have Reagan justices, Bush justices, Eisenhower justices that would not necessarily always select the outcome that the current Republican Party wanted. And this was true of the inverse as well. Sometimes you had democratically appointed justices that did not always go with their party's side.
Okay, so I get it, but in each case here, we have these myths, and they really get bandied about. And the average citizen who doesn't really know anything about how the Supreme Court works has strong opinions about this. The average American who doesn't really know anything about lobbyists has strong opinions about this. How do we train the American people so that their just concerns about what's wrong with government, what's wrong with Congress, target the things that are really wrong and could change the country? Casey, you see all of this. What would it take for the American people to sort of mature themselves and so they focus on what really will help us be governed?
It's the fundamental question, right? And one that my therapist wife really helped me put to paper, and why this came about, that you cannot solve the consequence without solving the cause, right? That you have to go back to the underlying assumptions, because you're exactly right, Clay. It's one thing for the average America to just think these or be told these and accept them. It's another, the one that we're experiencing day in and day out now, that these myths, these misunderstandings can be weaponized for partisan ends, right? We've saw a presidential campaign literally run, and the crowds cheer with, "On day one, I will." right? That type of rhetoric, that type of language that then was then executed on day one with a signing statement of stacks and stacks of executive orders, with a president legislating from the Oval Office, where obviously the Constitution did not intend that to be. To answer your question, to me, it has to go with getting past the myths. The only way you can get past the myths is to, one, break them down, and then two, and this is a much, much bigger conversation, is I am one of the biggest proponents of civics education that this country has. Like, we have to have a wholesale reinvestment in that. Civics is the active participation in our democracy. How to read a ballot, right? Like, how to have the conversations to appeal to the decision makers. How do you coalition build? These are active democratic skills that just simply have been tossed out or neglected or moved on from. And we need a whole-scale commitment to this, because you're right. We can't just expect 18-year-olds when they're 17 be taught about where the Constitution, the separation of powers, those are important things. But then when they turn 18, be thrust out into the world and say, go vote, we trust you. That's just like we teach math when we're 5 years old, just like we teach language when we're 5 years old, we should teach government and civics and active participation in our democracy well before we're ever asked to go out and throw our name or attach our name onto a ballot. It's just the wrong way of doing it.
Now, Casey, I know you're much less creepy about Mr. Jefferson than Lindsay is, and you know he said that if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect what never has been and never can be. I mean, he viewed public education as primarily civics training, that's why we do it. You're born with civil rights, but you're not born with civic capacities or enlightenment.
Yes, absolutely. Like, this is a downward trend that we've been going on for far too long, and now you start talking. Clay, did you take civics when you were in school?
In 8th grade.
You had a civics dedicated class?
Yes.
Yeah. Fewer than 10% of high schools, junior highs, or middle schools have a civics class. We have government and we pretend that's the same thing. It's not.
No, it's not. All right. So I really wish I could get some of these people, some of your guests here, maybe I can, to do further programs. And Lindsay, maybe, and Casey, maybe both of you would join me, because there's so many of these we probably will not get to here. The media wants to polarize us, keep our politics out of my sports. I wish the parties would work together. Lobbyists are evil. Politicians are bought and paid for. The president should just. And that's where I want to start when we come back. I'm having a really lovely, spirited conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky, who is at Mount Vernon, and Dr. Casey Burgat, assistant professor of political management at George Washington University. When we come back, we're going to talk about sports for a moment. Keep listening, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to this third segment of our conversation with Lindsay Chervinsky and Casey Burgat about this new, really interesting book, We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back. Number 13 on this list is Keep Your Politics Out of My Sports. Casey, tell us what that one's about. Jane McManus. Who's Jane McManus, and why do we care?
Yeah, she's a former ESPN writer. She taught at Seton Hall. She is a media journalist that focuses on sports. And so she was an obvious selection to write this, because she's been in and out of sports her whole life, and obviously recognizes that there is a myth that there has ever been a separation between sports and politics. And this goes back to literally the Roman Colosseum, right? And that's because sports can be an incredibly powerful, not only symbol for what a culture believes in, but also a great opportunity for not only political parties, politicians, but also our culture itself to advance conversations that would otherwise come later or maybe be ignored outright. So there has been a frustration for a long time, and an increasing frustration, probably peaking with Colin Kaepernick kneeling with the national anthem, that has continued on, where people absolutely want a clear line of demarcation between sports that are just entertainment, and I go there to disappear from politics, and politics where we can have these knockdown, drag out, exacerbating debates. But it's never that simple, right? That these political conversations often take place not only in our fields, but in the stands. The politicians and the bureaucracies recognize the power of sports. They have invested in the power of sports, and we still yet are claiming that they should be kept separate. They never can be, never will be, nor should we want them to be. And this is the chapter that is unlike all of the others. This is the one I wanted to include in it because not only am I an avid sports fan, but because I recognize that when we are in the stands cheering on our team, not unlike how we cheer on our party labels, you don't look at the person next to you and say, hey, who'd you vote for, by the way? Can we still be friends even though we're fans of the same team? That should be an opportunity to treat each other the way we treat our fellow sports fan. It doesn't have to come with a party label that often separates us more than it can unite us.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, politics and sports. The President of the United States was at the Super Bowl until the third quarter. He then had a little cheap shot about one of the most famous musicians on earth. I remember when the Vice President of the United States in the last Trump administration walked out on a professional game because athletes were kneeling. I'm old enough to remember 1968, the Olympics in Mexico City, when American black athletes raised their fist. Sports and politics have been involved, interwoven in some really important ways. But you do hear over and over, shut up and dribble, shut up and dribble. We pay you to entertain us, to bounce a ball, to throw a ball. Just because you're a great basketball player does not make you an expert on public policy. So please just shut up and dribble. And you're saying it ain't never been that way, and we should stop trying to think that it could be, these things could be separated.
Yeah, nor should we want it that way, right? Like these folks are incredibly powerful in our culture. You may not think that they should have the ability to influence what people think about politics or who they should vote for, but do you think that way about every segment of our society? There's just this discounting of sports figures as having any semblance of meaningful impact on our politics or what we should believe in. That isn't true. Some of them are some of the most thoughtful people. Have you read Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's essays? Amazing. And he is incredibly informed and thoughtful and provocative, and he should use his platform just like every other American should be able to use their platform on anything that they want. That's exactly what makes America great again, and I can't believe I just said it.
You just said that. My goodness. Oh, my. See, we're all getting on board now. All right, so Muhammad Ali famously refused to be inducted into the United States Army. And is said to have said, no Viet Cong ever called me N. He changed the world. He eventually became one of the most admired people on the planet. He was vindicated in his view of this, and we treated him with extraordinary disrespect in so many ways during that volatile period. Casey, how do we bring the temperature down on this? Sports heroes talking about politics is really actually quite important. Let me just give you one example. When George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I turned on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, and it was interesting. Then I turned on ESPN, and the best commentary I heard that night and for the next 5 days was from professional athletes. And I remember one of them used to be a great basketball player for the Boston Celtics, saying to the host, "You don't understand, because when your son gets in a car, you don't have to give him the talk. And every time our sons and even daughters, if we're African Americans, get into a vehicle and leave home, we don't know whether we're ever going to see them again." And so, I mean, the commentary was profound. It didn't use any of the political cliches that we're all so used to. There was none of that sort of, well, this is no time to talk about this, that kind of evasive rhetoric that we get from professional politicians. And so I came away thinking sports is just a window, and it's a really important window on American life.
100%. And they have platforms that they use for other things, for their shoes or their products or whatever they're endorsing. And that should and can extend to their political thoughts, right? Like they are seen as heroes within our society. That's the value we put on sports and the ones who are best at it. And they should be able, and we benefit from them being able to voice their perspectives, because often a lot of them come from perspectives we don't have. Poor socioeconomic backgrounds, often from inner cities. Like these are people that have perspectives that deserve a voice and often are going unheard by the masses. So yes, use their platform, give us their perspective, let us know where they're coming from, why they believe in what they believe in, just the same way that you and I can flip on this camera and do the same. And that can advance conversations that would otherwise go ignored or outright forgotten. It's important that we do so.
Thank you. Lindsay, just my sense is you're not a great sports fan, but I could be completely wrong.
We clearly haven't talked about sports. No, so I grew up in a house. The key to understanding both my sense of humor and a lot of my hobbies is that I have many older brothers. And I grew up in a house dominated by sports. And so and my brothers are much older than me. So when I was 4, I was going to my brother's football games. And I have a picture of me in onesie pajamas wearing his football helmet on the bleachers. So ever since, I have been I typically focus on baseball and football. Those are my two, although my family also very much likes basketball. And I have refused to sacrifice my San Francisco sports fandom because I am not a fair weather fan.
I think we need a photograph of you in the onesie on the website. We'll leave that for the moment. Lindsay, let's go to The President Should Just by Elisa Farah Griffin. The president should just what?
Well, this is sort of it gets at the idea that the president should just be able to fix everything. The president should just fix the price of eggs tomorrow, and the president should just,
Build a wall.
Build a wall, abolish all student debt, take care of medical insurance, fix the crisis in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is true that the president is the most powerful person in the world and has more power in that position than any other. And yet it is also an extremely limited position because there are international actors that have a say in things and participate in global affairs. There are economic factors that are not in any one person's control, including things like supply chains and whether or not there's bird flu that requires us to kill off a lot of poultry that affects the price of eggs. And so I think, gets back to our conversation about civics education, which is that if you don't have an understanding of what that job, and this is maybe a government piece, but if you don't have an understanding of what each branch is supposed to do, what the powers of each branch are, what the powers of the president are, what's the difference between state and local and federal government, where is the distribution of responsibilities, you're probably going to be pretty dissatisfied with your government because you're not actually going to know who to blame and who to ask for assistance. And so if you have a better understanding of the fact that the president can't just fix the economy, you are less likely to vote based on whether or not your sense of the economy is good, and rather a comprehensive overview of what a president or an administration has done.
Yeah, so I'm a student of the Founding Fathers too, and the Constitution, a document of 4,500 words or so. And the sense I got was that of the 3 branches of government, the legislative was to be supreme, that this is the branch that really represents the people, particularly the House, and therefore major things should come out of Congress and not out of the executive branch. And yet here we are, so that Barack Obama can say when he finds Congress totally bound up and uncooperative, well, I have a cell phone and a pen. And we now govern in large part by executive order. I think the founders were right about this one, and yet the exigencies, the realities of the world in which we live, where weapons can travel at the speed of sound, etc., suggest the need for something like a unitary executive. How does a person like you, Lindsay, sort all of that out when we know that the founders would be aghast by the apparent impotence of the Congress?
I think that they would be aghast. I think that they would be horrified at the imbalance that they see. I don't know that they would necessarily be surprised by the expansion of government or even the expansion of the responsibilities or even the expansion of the executive branch departments, because as responsibilities have increased for the federal government, so too is sort of the apparatus designed to oversee it. What they would be surprised about was that Congress is so willing to let go of its own powers. Congress is so willing to not practice oversight, to not check the executive, to not check the Supreme Court, because Congress was always quite jealous of its authority in the early republic, and most human institutions are. This is an aberration in human history because humans can usually be counted on to try and seize and accumulate power as opposed to let it go, especially when you're actually in office. And so they would just be blown away that Congress was so willing to subordinate itself to the executive.
Casey, you've been thinking about this too. It seems to me that this is a particularly difficult matter, that the Congress of the United States does a lot of things. We've been talking about that. but it doesn't particularly assert its primacy under the Constitution.
It tries when it cares, but it often uses let's just say, timely ignorance when it can get it faster through the executive branch, right? Like we see the forfeiture of executive power for partisan ends to presidents with whom they agree with. And then it's when it's a president they fundamentally disagree with that they start screaming from the rooftops of this is not how it's supposed to work, or this is Congress's duty. This is what happens when you leave a power vacuum. One, presidents are all too willing to fill it. They've proven it over and over and over. And then two, it's incredibly hard to claw back unless both parties agree that this is the time that we must do it. And we've seen instances of this, like in the early 70s, post-Watergate, where they wrote the new budget bill that decidedly said Congress can't impound funds, or Nixon can't impound funds. Now we're having that debate again. And notice that we're not having the same types of conversations, even though the presidency, the executive branch, through Doge, through Elon, who is neither Senate confirmed or the department is congressionally authorized or appropriated, we're having these same debates again, but now we hear Republicans. We don't hear Republicans shouting from the rooftops when they did when it was Obama or Biden doing these executive overreaches. These are politically convenient gripes that only come up when it's the other party doing it against them.
Alas, yes. So we have to go into rapid fire responses for a moment here. So Casey, number 6, politicians are bought and paid for. No?
No, I mean, they aren't. Like, go ask a member. This is talking about the mass amount of money in politics. So again, two things can be true. There is way too much money in politics, but it doesn't go to the ends that we think it is. The average American is being told and believes that politicians are just out there selling their votes to the highest bidder. But if you look at where money goes, who gives it to whom, it is only going to people who already agree with them, and that money is treated between the parties as this mutually assured destruction type of apparatus, right? This leads to just this back and forth of campaigns are incredibly expensive, that are billion-dollar campaigns where I have to raise more money than the other side as a means of declaring that I am more popular than the other side. It is not the bribery type of house of cards story that is too easy to capitalize on.
Dr. Chervinsky, number 11, the filibuster forces compromise. What?
Yes, the filibuster is one of the most hotly contested, I think, topics both in this volume and largely in politics. And the idea by the supporters of the filibuster, most famously in the last term, Joe Manchin, was that if you have a filibuster, you have to get over 60 votes, which means that you have to compromise. And this chapter breaks down that myth that it actually kind of forces partisanization of issues and makes it harder to compromise. I would also argue is not based in constitutional origin if we are interested in original intent of the Constitution.
Okay, so the filibuster, in your opinion, Lindsay, should stay or go? It's not in the Constitution of the United States.
I do see arguments in favor of a amended filibuster. I'm fine with having a filibuster if you actually have to do something. So if you have to stand on the floor, yes. If you have to talk for 30 hours, by all means. But now the way the filibuster currently works is you basically send an email, and that's ridiculous. I would be in favor of a filibuster that takes it more towards its roots when it first emerged.
Casey, you get the last word today. I'm so sorry we don't have a couple of more hours. Number 12, the media wants to polarize us. Oh man, I turn on some questions. See, for example, let's see, we're going to annex Greenland. I go to MSNBC and I hear exactly what we all would predict. I go to Fox and I hear exactly what we all would predict. Each side says the other one doesn't understand. Each side says the other is not really America. The other side is either stupid and rural or it's academic elites who are out of touch with the country. It sure feels like it polarizes us.
Yeah, so the key word there is once, right? And so there's two myths within that chapter title, the media wants to polarize us. Number one, the media, the conglomerate that is the media. And here we're equating Fox News with some, with the New York Times, with the Washington Post, with some dude in his basement and a Substack, right? And Joe Rogan, throw him in there too. The media is all this one big umbrella and they're all the same and their process is all the same, right? Stop doing that. right? That is not the media. When you say media, name your source. I found that is an incredibly helpful thing to say, I saw on, and then literally say where you see it, because then you'll start checking yourself. You'll start embarrassing yourself about, you don't want to admit where you actually saw these things because it is not as trusted or as newsworthy as a lot of the places where we do get our news. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the wants. When you talk to these folks, the actual media people who have to go through levels and levels of fact checking because they are subject to libel laws and subject to lawsuits in a way that some dude with a Twitter feed isn't, they don't want to do this. They want to break news. They want to tell you the stories, even they want to expose corruption. They want to tell you what's going wrong and often where Congress or the president is failing. That's good. That's where they're supposed to come in and let us know about things that we would otherwise not know about. But they recognize that they are part of this incentive structure where we, the people, are the ones creating, right? They give us what we want the same way my bartender is going to give us what we want later on. You can't blame the bartender for getting you for what you asked for. And this is what we do with our algorithms, our social media, our clicks, our attention. And so if you want to change what you are seeing and viewing and watching, you better check yourself and what your algorithms are providing you. You asked for it.
We hold these truths, how to spot the myths that are holding America back. So, Casey, I hope you're putting a copy of this into the hands of every member of Congress. That's only 535 copies after all.
I'd love to. I don't mind it. I feel like a lot of them, if we gave the option of who you want to send it to, Ted Cruz would get almost all of those copies. But yeah, I'd like to get it in every single one of those offices.
Wow, this has been great. I so appreciate it. People can get this book at their local independent bookstore, or they can order it from Barnes & Noble and Amazon, etc. I so appreciate both of you. I urge all of our listeners to take a look at this, and we will talk further about it. But for the moment, Dr. Casey Burgat of George Washington University and our old friend Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you for joining us on Listening to America. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.